I'm sorry? No, no. Okay, good afternoon. And I want to start by letting you know that we are moving on from fixtures. We have moved on to the material in the syllabus covered under estates. The relevant worksheet has not been uploaded to e-learning yet. That is on my to-do list for this evening or tomorrow. Hopefully this evening. It will depend on some other things. But that is the option. It's going to be in y'all's interest to sit over here, because if you sit too far off to the right, you're not going to be able to see the board, and we're going to be making fairly extensive use of it today. So, and unfortunately, everything is turned to accommodate the camera, and so you guys have to sort of turn with it. Okay, so I want to start by talking about tenures, the doctrine of tenures. And I want to start by dismissing it, not entirely, okay? The doctrine of tenures is the doctrine that nobody owns land, right? Only the crown owns land, and the rest of us just sort of receive some sort of interest from the crown in exchange for whatever, okay? So if you're interested in this, if this is something that seems interesting to you and you want to sort of chase down the details about it, Chapter 3 in the Owusu book actually gives a fairly reasonable explanation of the story that lawyers tell ourselves about the evolution of the doctrine of tenures and sort of how it turned into the modern property law system that we have. Now, one of the things that you may note, and this is not limited to Owusu, this is something that's common sort of throughout when lawyers talk about these types of things, is that the sources that the lawyers draw on, that we as lawyers draw on to discuss medieval property arrangements, were all written in the late 19th and early 20th century, right? So Professor Owusu cites a book about medieval tenures written in 1908. You don't have to be super engaged with the profession of history to know that our understanding of these issues has evolved, right? We know more about how the medieval system actually worked now than we did then. So this is not a criticism of anything, of any of the authorities, right? Because we're telling ourselves a story, okay? And no worries. We're telling, for those of you who weren't in the room, somebody came in, apparently this was not the class they were supposed to be attending, and they left. So they apologized on their way out, no problem. Okay, so this is the story that we tell ourselves. And we are constructing a history for our doctrine, and whether or not it's true, whether or not it actually reflects medieval practice, isn't super important, okay? Except when it is. And let me explain what I mean by this, okay? If you are litigating a case, and opposing counsel puts before the court an argument that, this case is controlled by this understanding of the historical common law. And the understanding that they're putting forward is based on some sort of mistaken, right, or out of date understanding of actual historical practice? Does the authority that opposing counsel's relying on carry the weight that they want it to carry? And if it doesn't, how do we convince the court that it doesn't? I don't have answers to these questions, right? These are sort of very high-level theoretical questions that I hope never become issues for you in the practice of law. But in the event that they do, you can think back to this conversation. You can go, all right, Dr. Krell says there's no real good answer here, so I guess I'm just out of luck. Don't think you're out of luck. But you should be honest with your client that these issues, when they arise, are real issues. If you find yourself being opposing counsel in this hypothetical, you should be asking yourself, how vital is this doctrine? And vital in the sense of how living is it? Okay, how connected to our current understanding of actual historical practice is this? I'll give you an example and then I'm going to move on. There is this notion floating around in commercial law, in particular, that these laws descend from a special body of law that was only practiced by merchants, and that it was consistent across European merchant communities throughout the Middle Ages, right? There was the law merchant, and it was separate from the common law in England. It was separate from the Roman law in the mainland. It was the law of commercial practice across Christendom. This concept of the law merchant is completely fabricated. There is no evidence in modern historical scholarship that it ever existed. Essentially, what happened was there were a couple of fairs, mostly at St. Ives in England, where the owner of the fair convened a court consisting of the merchants in the fair. And they made a couple of references to their usual commercial practice. But all of this was done using the same system and the same mechanisms as any other common law litigation at the time. The only difference was the participants. And from this, we've created this entire concept. And so tenures operate very similarly. There's very little evidence that most of the tenures that are described ever existed. And in fact, Professor Owusu sort of acknowledges that a lot of the sort of very high-end tenures, the grand sergeantry tenures, very quickly fell into disuse to the extent that they ever actually existed, because they're predicated on personal service to the king, right? They're the notion that because you're the king's falconer, that grants you certain rights and privileges, okay? So with all of this sort of as prelude and as caveat, let's talk about how we understand estates today, as best we can do. This is a little bit complicated, but we've got a couple of weeks and we're gonna sort of work through it. So, here we have the universe. Pretty unimpressive. Let us consider a thing.
Sir, I think you should hold the
Well, let's do that. I'm nervous about pulling it down on myself, to be frank. All right. Better? Well, the camera actually has a zoom function, but I appreciate it. It was not? Okay, thanks. Okay. So we have a thing. Okay? And this thing exists across time. So as a good social scientist, allow me to mark my axes, right? So time is along the x-axis, and the y-axis consists of things. Okay. So we have a thing. Let's consider that it is a piece of land. When does the piece of land come into existence? When the earth cools, right? We're not gonna be concerned about processes on a geological scale, but for our intents and purposes, the land can be said to have existed forever in the past. When does the land cease to exist? Again, we're not concerned about geological timescales, so for our purposes, never. So across the entire expanse of time, the land exists. I'm going to put down a marker. This marker is for the year 1066. Why does the year 1066 matter? Why does the year 1066 matter? Yes, Rihanna, the Norman Conquest. This is a moment universally acknowledged in common law jurisdictions as being a time of change. Okay? This is a point in time where the legal system in effect prior to this point, the legal system that governs the land prior to this point, ceases to exist, and it is replaced with a new system that eventually becomes what we recognize as the modern common law. So we're going to put a marker here for a uncertain period of time. And we are going to put another time marker down that we're going to label as T0. So let me start by saying T0 does not matter when it is. If it is after 1066 and with some after some statutory enactments that we'll talk about later, we're going to assume that this is a modern period, and that looks like the word two. So let me just T0. Now that's clear. Okay. So at T0, this piece of land that is represented by this green line, we'll call it Green Acre. Comes into the possession of Albert. So Albert, at time 0, acquires Green Acre. Okay? Absent any other comment, if I gave you no further information, at what point does Albert cease to have Green Acre? Correct. I've given you no information, you should assume that Albert's interest, nope, not on that marker. Albert's interest goes on forever. One of you guys that's in the room, don't let me forget to pick that up. I don't want to leave it as litter. Okay, so Albert's interest goes on forever. We refer to this as what? Yeah.
You're asking what's already, or
I'm sorry?
you're asking what this is called forever?
Yes. What is it called if he owns it forever? What is his interest referred to as?
Would that be fee simple?
Yes. Fee simple, sometimes referred to as absolute. But if you just refer to fee simple, same thing. Okay? Now, yes. The green?
Yeah.
Well, it just says fee simple absolute. But thank you for. Yes, fee simple. Okay. Maybe. I'm not sure how we. Anyway. So let us suppose that Albert's interest terminates at a future time. So this is T1. Okay. What kind of estate does Albert have if there is a future time that his interest terminates? Now, the answer is he may have one of several estates, depending on why his interest terminates. So, for example, if T1 is determined by Albert's death, then he has what is called a life estate. A life estate, right? So if we know that Albert's going to die, because so far every human being who's lived has died. Raise your hand if you plan to be the first one to break that rule. I mean, what? Okay, so yes, we know that Albert's going to die. And so if his estate terminates upon his death, he has a life estate. If his estate terminates upon a determined event, so when this happens, his estate ends. He has what is called a fee simple determinable. Okay? If his estate ends, when something ceases to happen. Then he holds a fee simple subject to a condition subsequent. Okay? Now, I want to let you guys in on a little secret. I figured out the difference between a fee simple determinable and a fee simple subject to a condition subsequent about a week ago. Okay, yes.
You said a fee simple also like ownership for life, right? For life.
No, ownership forever.
Forever.
Yes.
So if you die, it's still yours.
If you die, it means that what happens with fee simple absolute is that when you die, you have the ability to determine where it goes. So it goes to your heirs or to some person that you designate in your estate.
Also, so from fee simple, you can transfer it for life as it expires.
Right. Right. Once you're dead, you no longer have any control over it. And I guess technically in fee simple, you also don't have control. It just passes to the next person that you designated, right? Yes. Okay, so these are two different types of interests related to the possibility that a future event will terminate your estate. Okay, so if the event that terminates your estate is something that happens, you have a fee simple determinable. If the event that terminates your estate is something that ceases to happen, you have a fee simple subject to condition subsequent. And I want to emphasize this distinction is something I figured out very recently. So if it is confusing to you, it's okay. You can still be, well, as successful as I am, whatever that means, while still not understanding the difference between these two types of interests, okay? So what we mean by this is if I say, Albert, I'm going to give you Greenacre until Betty reaches the age of majority. Is that an event that happens or an event that ceases to happen? Right, it's an event that happens, so that would be a fee simple determinable, right? If I say, Albert, I'm going to give you Greenacre so long as you farm on it. Is that an event that happens or an event that ceases to happen? Right. So this would be a fee simple subject to condition subsequent. Okay? Do we understand these types of present estates? Okay. Let me complicate this one more way, okay? If I say, Albert, you can have Greenacre so long as I live, and then it goes to someone else, Bob, Betty, whoever, okay? What does Albert have? Okay, let me finish what I'm in the middle of, and then I'll recover this again. What does Albert have if I tell him, you can have Greenacre so long as I live, and then Betty gets it?
That would be a fee simple determinable.
Mm-hmm.
I would say fee simple determinable because as you say that he passes as long as you are alive. So the future event will determine that.
So this one's a tricky one. What makes something the fee simple determinable or the fee simple condition subsequent is that the future event may not happen. So If we know that the future event is going to happen, and the only future event that we know for a fact will always happen is that every living human will die, at least as of now. And so this is a life estate. But because it's not Albert's life, it's mine, this is called a life estate per otra v. That because, you know, Normans, and so it's French. The life estate per otra v is a life estate for someone else's life. The French here means for other life. Easy peasy, right? Okay, so let me go through this again. Right? We said on the very first day of class, property interests are defined by space, right? By the thing that is occupied, and time, right? Our interest has a beginning and an end. So if there's no end in the interest, if I have the ability to pass the property on to my heirs when I die, this is fee simple absolute. Okay? Limitations on present estates. Limitations on present estates come in three forms. Events that we know are going to happen, of which there is precisely one type, which is death. Okay? Those estates are called life estates. If the terminating event is the death of the recipient, it's just a life estate. If the terminating event is the death of some other person, whether it's the seller or a third party or Her Majesty the Queen, right? It's a life estate per otra v. With future events where we don't know if they will happen, there are two different types. There are events where something happens out in the world, right? A thing occurs, or something that is going on, right? A continuous activity ceases to occur. Okay? So if the terminating event is a thing that happens, right? A discrete event, boom, this now is a thing. We call it a fee simple determinable. And if the subsequent event, if the terminating event is the cessation of an ongoing activity, this is a fee simple subject to condition subsequent. Okay? Do we feel like we have a better grip on this now in the chat? What? I can try. So, okay. Think about it in terms of what you can sell. Okay? So if Albert holds Greenacre in fee simple absolute, he can sell all of Greenacre or a piece of it, right? And that piece that he can sell can be limited in space, so he can sell part of the acreage, right? And keep some of it, or it can be limited in time. So he can sell it to someone for the length of their life, or for 10 years, right? That's a lease. We're gonna talk about that later, okay? Or he can sell it until some event occurs, or until some activity ceases to occur. Does maybe this make more sense? I'm not sure that there's another way to do this. The other piece of this is what happens when the estate terminates. Okay, so if Albert sells Greenacre, if he sells all of Greenacre forever, he sells it in fee simple, then Albert's out of the picture. He no longer exists, except in the past. Yes?
Okay, so does every estate have some right to sell, or the estate itself their right to it?
Yes. Every owner has the right to sell what they own, with the exception of fee tail owners. We're going to talk about that later. We're starting with the simple, and then we're going to complicate. Okay? But every owner can sell what they own. No owner can sell more than they own. Every owner can sell what they own. No owner can sell more than they own. Okay? So if Albert sells the fee simple, boom, he's done. If he sells a life estate, then what happens when Betty, he sells the life estate to Betty, what happens when Betty dies? What happens when Betty dies?
Will that land go back to the crown if she dies not alive estate?
Nope. What happens when Betty dies? Betty holds a life estate. Goes back to Albert. It goes back to Albert. Now, you may be asking, what happens if Albert dies before Betty? The answer is that Albert can give the land to his heirs. So when Betty dies, it goes to Albert's heirs, right? But that's a complication. Assume that Albert is still alive. He gets the land. So these are what we call future interests. Future interests. These are interests in land, right? Interests in Greenacre that come into existence at some future point, right? At T1, right? So here we are at T0. At T1, future interests come into actual existence. This, by the way, in property, we refer to this process of a future interest becoming a present interest and becoming possessory. We refer to it as vesting. Vesting. That term's going to be important, so write it down. Okay. There are 4 types of future interests. Anybody noticing a parallel? How many types of present interests are there? 4. There are 4 types of future interests. There is no future interest associated with the fee simple absolute, because it goes on forever. In a life estate, there are 2 types, there are 2 names for future interests. One is the reversion. It's called this because the original grantor retains it. So when the life estate ends, when Albert dies, the original grantor reverts. right? The land reverts to the original grantor. So again, right, to talk about, to have names on both people, Betty receives a life estate. When Betty dies, the land reverts to Albert. Now, Albert has the ability to say, I don't want this future interest. I want to give it to Carla. Okay? A reversionary interest, which is the future interest attached to a life estate, that is given to a third party, is referred to as a remainder. A remainder. Okay? The key thing to remember is that reversions and remainders are certain to vest. If you have a reversion or a remainder, this interest will always vest because they're attached, they follow life estates. And life estates always end because at some point, everyone dies. The third type of future interest is attached to,
Sir?
yes, I'm sorry.
Not reverse on remainder. You just create a link between your reverse and remainder.
I'm sorry, say that again.
You repeat the link between your reverse and remainder. So if I correct you're saying that our reversion that's given to a third party is a remainder.
Yes, yes, the reversion. Okay, so let me explain. So Albert, okay, so, right, at time one, so we're at time zero, at time one, which is a mark I've just put here, Albert conveys a life estate to Betty. At time two, Betty dies, okay? If at time two, the land reverts to Albert, this is a reversion. If at time two, the land reverts to Carla, this is a remainder. Make sense? Good. Okay. With a fee simple determinable, okay? What is that noise? Is that coming from the speaker or is that coming from outside? It wasn't a big deal. It was confusing me. So in fee simple determinables, right? In the event that the condition happens, the thing that we're looking for comes to fruition. The future interest in that case is called the possibility of, no, sorry, I'm about to give you bad information. No, I was right to begin with. Possibility of reverter. Possibility of reverter. It is called this because the future interest may never vest. It is only a possibility. Only a possibility. But it is called a reverter because, like a reversion, it's a reversionary interest in that when the event happens, the present estate terminates and the future interest vests. Why am I saying this? Because fee simples subject to a condition subsequent are different in this way. The future interest, if the condition subsequent is the ceasing to happen of an event, the future interest is called the right of reentry. The right of reentry. So called because the future interest holder has to exercise it. So the fee simple subject to condition subsequent does not terminate until the future interest holder exercises their right of reentry. Okay? So do we understand the terminology? This is going to get more complicated as we go on, but right now I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page as to the language. Yes, Maisha, that's absolutely correct. The fee simple subject to condition subsequent does not terminate when the condition subsequent triggers. It terminates when the condition subsequent triggers and the future interest holder exercises their right of reentry. Okay? Tiffany, the third form of the future interest is a possibility of reverter. A possibility of reverter. The four types, again, right? Reversion and remainder are future interests that attach to life estates. And which one is the correct term depends on whether the future interest is held by the original grantor, in which case you call it a reversion, or a third party, in which case it's called a remainder. And sometimes you will, I just want to say this as a small wrinkle, sometimes you will see the original grantor referred to as having a remainder. This is also correct, but you can't say that a third party holds a reversion. Okay, so I don't want you to worry about that, but if you see Albert sells a life estate to Betty and Albert has a remainder, that is a correct phrasing, okay? Then the other two are the possibility of reverter, which is what you have if you hold a future interest from a fee simple determinable, and the right of reentry, which is the future interest attached to a fee simple subject to condition subsequent. Okay. Last thing that I want to talk about, and let me start by saying that this is probably the single most confusing thing that can be found in the common law. If you want to discuss it in more detail, Dr. Yearwood's classes on trusts discuss this in great detail. This, what I am referring to, is the rule against perpetuities. The rule against perpetuities. The idea behind the rule against perpetuities is we don't want our land, we don't want property to be controlled by people who've been dead for hundreds of years, right? Property should be used to benefit the living, should be used in ways that make sense to the living. And so attempting to create a perpetuity is not allowed. What is a perpetuity? A perpetuity, and you know what? I'm going to put this in the chat so that I know everybody sees it as I say it. A perpetuity is a future interest in property that does not vest before 21 years after all lives in being at its creation are over. A future interest in property that does not vest before 21 years after all lives in being at its creation are over. What does that mean? Okay, and this is the common law rule. This rule's been changed by statute in almost every jurisdiction, mostly changing the time period, but also changing, but there's other things as well. Again, if you're interested in the details of this, take Dr. Yearwood's classes, okay? The first question is, what the heck is a life in being? The answer is any person that is alive. So the way the rule is phrased, the rule forbids a future interest in property that does not vest until more than 21 years after everyone who is currently alive has died. If this seems insane to you, that's okay. Okay? What does it mean that the future interest does not vest? What it means, right, as we discussed, is when these present interests extinguish and the future interest becomes possessor. Okay? So, right, under the common law rule, under the original common law rule, the rule against perpetuities was violated if we didn't know whether the future interest would vest. We have to be able to say, this is the date by which this interest will vest, and so it is, and so we know that that date falls within the relevant time period, therefore it is not a perpetuity and we can allow it. Okay? As the rule has evolved, a lot of courts take what's called the wait and see approach, which is where they say, okay, well, it might not vest in the relevant time period, but we're going to wait and see, and if it does, then great. If it doesn't, then we set it aside. Okay? Some examples of future interests that would violate the rule against perpetuities, and then I will let you go. Basically, so first of all, life estates never create perpetuities because there is a life in being that will die, and at that point, the future interest immediately vests. So there's no way that the future interest continues to be uncertain for the period of time, right? So life estates never create perpetuities. Fee simple determinable. If in say the year 1900, I were to dispose of Greenacre to Albert until Barbados removes the Queen as the head of state. This would be a perpetuity because we don't know when that's going to happen, right, in the year 1900. Obviously, in 2020, we know when it's going to happen. It's going to happen next year. But we don't know when that's going to happen, and so we don't know if the future interest is going to vest in enough time to not violate the rule. Fee simple subject to condition subsequent. I sell Greenacre to Albert for so long as the land shall be used for farming. Because for all I know, Albert may be a farmer, his kid may be a farmer, his grandkid may be a farmer, his great grandkid, and at that point, we're moving on beyond the relevant time period, right? If not the great grandkid, almost certainly the great great grandkid. So in those cases, the perpetuity is void. All right, so I hope that this has given you some grip on the terminology that's involved. On Thursday, we're going to talk a little bit more about how you can tell when a given interest has been created. And then next week, we're going to talk about how you sort of trace through and determine what interest belongs to whom over the at a given point in time. Okay, so see you guys over the course of the week, and I'll see you guys on Thursday at the very least. So.